Hi, welcome to Module 4.1, Commissioning and Contract Closure. As always, we'd like to thank Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation for their support of this course through the project Community-Led Design for Specialized Housing in the North, and to acknowledge the partnership that makes this course possible between Together Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University, Nishnawbe Aski Nation, the Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University, and WASA Distance Education Centre. In this module, we're going to look at how you can effectively and correctly close contracts with any remaining contractors through a process called commissioning, how you address outstanding concerns, and issue a final certificate of completion. So one of the distinctions that I think we need to make in this section, and one that I think we've made before, is the difference between the construction project or capital project ending and the whole project ending. Here, commissioning, what we'll be talking about mostly in this module, is the process that triggers the end of the construction process. During this process, you'll have the opportunity to review work by outstanding contractors and close out any remaining contracts. What's important to think about at this stage is that you follow a correct set of steps that make sure that everything, all the deficiencies, are addressed before contractors pack up and leave. And there is a right way to do that. Your role as the PM in this phase is a few things. First, ensuring that all of the contracted elements have been fulfilled. This often means a walkthrough, or more likely series of walkthroughs, that are a really detailed inspection of the work that's been done. And it may be best if your experience as the project manager is less technical and maybe more administrative, that you have someone with a more technical or construction background accompany you on these inspections so that you can make sure what you're reviewing in the contract has been appropriately fulfilled. And then this includes a documenting and recording of anything that was found during the walkthroughs that's deficient to make sure that you have the appropriate record, and this record begins to act as the kind of new contract, the contract between those walkthroughs and finishing, so that there's accountability at the end of the project. Then you pay out the final installment once those changes have been made and your construction project comes to an end. So let's get into that in some more detail. First, don't be alarmed if at the commissioning phase right now, there are a few outstanding issues that are found during the walkthroughs. This is common and it's the point of the process. It shouldn't necessarily be a red flag that the contractor has done poor work. It should be taken seriously though, and this time should be used to get a really good sense of what needs to be done before the contract gets closed. The most important thing in this phase though is recording what is found. Often at this stage there can be a tendency, especially during the walkthroughs, but it can also happen after, to reach a bunch of verbal agreements between yourself, the client, and the contractors. For everyone during the walkthrough to say, oh yeah, don't worry, I'll get that done, or oh yeah, I understand the problem. That's not best practice. Instead, a ledger or list should be created with all of the deficiencies that were found during the commissioning process, and they should be assigned based on the original contracts to who is responsible for addressing that deficiency, and then a timeline should be negotiated with that contractor to get us to completion. Returning back to my earlier point though about there being different and overlapping timelines and meanings for an end of project, here on the commissioning timeline, we're talking about reaching a goal of substantial completion or the end of construction. And that is an important step in this process, but it's not your only responsibility as the project manager. There's often a lot of work that needs to be done post-construction, leading up to occupancy, And then as well as we'll see in the next module, 4.2, that there's ongoing work that you have as the project manager, even beyond occupancy, to manage the asset that now belongs to the First Nation. So as I said in the previous slide, the end of the construction or the end of the capital project is called substantial completion. And usually you reach this point once all of the deficiencies that were found during commissioning have been addressed, and you can then issue a certificate of substantial completion to the contractor, which signals the end of their work, duties, and liabilities. They're finished. I do want to add a note here, though, that kind of complicates what we've been talking about. The process that I'm describing of commissioning is really one that will exist in this simple way if you've hired a single general contractor who's responsible for hiring and overseeing all of the sub-trades and others involved in the building process. As we've described throughout this course, there's a variety of contract and project management arrangements that are possible and totally acceptable for a housing project. So if, for example, you as the project manager are also acting as the kind of de facto general contractor and hiring a variety of sub-trades yourself, you will go through the same process, but in a smaller and more targeted way, when each of your trades or contractors completes their portion of the building project. So each time you're closing out a contract, you will go through a kind of mini version of the commissioning process and of recording outstanding deficiencies and creating a plan for addressing them. Once you've completed all of your contracts, or in the earlier example, your kind of single contract, there are a number of things that the contractor should be turning over to you. And these can be important both for the long-term management of the asset and for reporting to close out with your funders, whoever they might be. And these should include things like the as-built drawings. So you'll remember all the way back in section 2, when you were selecting a design for the construction process, that design is not necessarily going to be exactly what was built. And we've seen through subsequent modules about monitoring that there has to be a certain amount of flexibility that exists with the project on the ground. And what you're going to want to keep in your records is the as-built drawings, not the kind of pre-construction theoretical drawings, but the ones that have been adapted to site with any changes that were made because of material availability or site-specific adaptations or any other changes that were made for whatever reason that can sometimes get redlined or added to the drawings. You want to make sure you have what was built so that any work that needs to be done later can be addressing what was actually built and not the kind of theoretical design. The second is operation and maintenance manuals. So for any electrical or mechanical components, you want to make sure that you have the kind of user guides for what was installed. And along that same line, the kind of warranties that may exist for things like windows or mechanical parts that have been installed. Basically, you want all the written information for the components that other contractors will have installed in the house along the way. And then finally, and this can be really important for your funders, is test reports. So as things are being installed, as inspections are taking place, there's going to be a bunch of testing done on the house to make sure that it meets the required standards for what was being built, and you're going to need to make sure you have a copy of all of those tests and inspections. And then that concludes the capital project. Your house should be built, and you should now have all the documentation that goes along with it. And so with that, we're going to turn our attention to review and evaluation. But as always, if you'd like to learn anything more about what was discussed in this module, the references and resources are on screen now. Thanks.